this is a necessary conversation that we need to have. It's a conversation that we need to have because it's been 8 months, 8 straight months since the conflict in Gaza. So this is a necessary conversation that we need to have because Benjamin Netanyahu, this guy is completely out of control. The guy genuinely is out of control, right? And I feel like there isn't anybody out there in terms of like global leaders who can actually hold this guy to account. Everybody, the United States, and most global powers are siding with him. But obviously there's many factors to why this is the case. There's many factors. One of them obviously being Israel is just unconditionally an ally to these countries. Basically whatever Israel does goes. Israel can never do anything wrong. So that's what unconditional allyship basically means. Whatever Israel does just basically goes. Well, I think we're tired of this narrative. And the other one is the worst one, to be honest, from my perspective. And this is the Holocaust, the history of Jewish people and the Holocaust. So most Western governments have this idea that they just need to side and show unconditional support for Israel, regardless of what they've done, because a lot of these people are Jewish people. My problem is not even with that per se. My problem is, why does that have to come at the expense of people in Gaza, right? Look at what's going on in Rafah, the refugee camp. Countless people have been slaughtered. People who had nothing to do with Hamas. They've got nothing to do with Hamas in any way, shape or form, in any way imaginable, right? Got bombed, and a lot of them were killed for no reason, right? People are losing count already. Some people are still arguing that 35,000 people have been killed. Obviously, those figures came out like a month ago. So obviously after the attacks in Rafah, the numbers have probably gone up significantly. So this begs the question, is Benjamin Netanyahu a psychopath? My perspective, 100%. The guy is a terrible human being. It's already been 8 months. 8 months since October the 7th happened. And from then on, you know who's been on the offense? Israel, right? 35,000 people have been slaughtered in the space of 8 months. About 70% of these people are women and children. And the issue primarily is the fact that our governments, like our Western governments, are siding with Israel regardless of the genocide that's been committed in Gaza. So obviously some people would make the argument by saying, obviously we're trying to get rid of Hamas, right? Israel has attacked Rafah, a refugee camp, right? Israel has attacked the West Bank, where there was no Hamas. So Hamas is not the government in the West Bank, but they've still attacked the West Bank. So the problem, again, just like I mentioned, is not really necessarily Hamas. The problem is Benjamin Netanyahu. The guy's ego is hurt, right? The guy's got a massive ego, right? And he's so desperate to cling on to power because he understands that the longer this conflict goes on, the longer he stays in power, because he's not a very favorable or likable guy in Israel. Now, the problem with Israel is that Israel is an incredibly fascist society, meaning that you know how most people in the West, for example, in England, in America, in France, tend to generally align or gravitate towards left-wing political ideology, socialism, economic equality, and all these different ideas, right? Feminism. In Israel, it's the opposite, right? The vast majority of people in Israel are actually right-wing nationalists, so like Zionists and all these sort of like different supremacist groups, basically. And that's the difference, right? So it's not coincidental why, when you look at Western reporters, they tend generally not to interview people from Israel. The vast majority of journalists, generally speaking, tend to interview people like governments, for example. They generally tend to have representatives speak for the people because they understand if they ever get the opportunity to put a microphone in front of the faces of Israel or like Zionists, right, some of the things that these people would say about Palestinian people, it would sound like something that the Nazis were saying about Jewish people during the Holocaust. So that's the issue. So it's a very incredibly fascist society Israel is. And they claim that the Arabs that live in Israel have equal rights. but I guarantee if you go to Israel and speak to the Arabs that live there, right, and they were honest to you, I guarantee most of them would tell you that their lives in Israel is horrendous, right? And I've never been there, right? But I know Israel is obviously a country that I would never go. But I promise you that if you interview the Arabs that they keep saying have a decent life in Israel, you go out and interview these people, and the vast majority of them would tell you that their lives are miserable in that country. Why? Because obviously there's not going to be equality, right? There's going to be a lot of discrimination against these people. Things like upward mobility, for example, political rights, social rights, economic freedom. These are things that these people wouldn't have. Right now, Israel might not be explicit with the discrimination against them, which I think they would be. But even if they're not, the reality is that it still exists. Right? So this idea that like the Arabs that live in Israel are having a decent time is just factually inaccurate. And then not long ago, we've had the head of the ICJ, which is the International Court of Justice, come out. So he came out and he obviously did an interview. I think he did the interview with CNN, talking about the intent of prosecuting Benjamin Netanyahu and prosecuting the leader of Hamas. To be honest, but I think the issue with the ICJ and this whole concept of international law is that I don't believe that international law is applied fairly and transparently or equally. It's not. And what I mean by this is we've seen examples, leaders from Eastern Europe, for example, or leaders from Latin America or even Africa, who some people would argue are terrible people and they've done terrible stuff or horrendous stuff against their own people. But the conviction rates for these people when it comes to the International Court of Justice is high. So about a 95% conviction rate, right? The evidence is clear. A lot of people have been convicted and sentenced, the likes of Slobodan Milosevic of Serbia, right, during the Bosnian War. There's many other people in places like Africa and Latin America who've been convicted by the ICJ. But the problem is when it comes to Western leaders, for example, all of a sudden there's no convictions. I mean, people have a strong argument about the war in Iraq, right? Number one, the war was based on a lie. So the American government sold the public a lie, which is that Iraq is a weapon of mass destruction with zero evidence. So they basically fabricated evidence about Iraq is having a weapon of mass destruction, which was just basically factually incorrect, right? So they went in and started a war that led to countless lives being lost, right? So I don't understand why George W. Bush and Tony Blair have not been convicted or at least trialed under the International Court of Justice for what they've done in Iraq. But people from like poor countries always get convicted, arrested, sent to the ICJ, convicted and sent to prison. Right, so that's what I mean by the International Court of Justice and this whole concept of international law. The whole philosophy behind it, I agree with. But when it comes to the application of the law, there is an imbalance or there's an inequality. And often the people who tend to be convicted tend to be poor people and people that come from poor countries, and the people who tend to get away with it, broadly speaking, then come from powerful countries like the United States of America and Britain, for example. So there's never been any person as I'm aware of who's ever been convicted under the ICJ who's from a Western country. Right, so there's that imbalance. So Benjamin Netanyahu, I guess, should be the target for the International Court of Justice, right? To be honest, because I believe that Hamas are acting on self-defense, to be honest. So this idea of trying to compare Hamas to the Israeli government or military is completely ridiculous, to be honest, because I mean the things that Israel has done in Gaza for the last 70 years, right? I mean the comparison would be absolutely ridiculous to even try and attempt to, honestly speaking. So that is already out of the equation, to be honest, ladies and gentlemen. But I genuinely want to understand your perspective on the conflict, to be honest, and I hope most people are on my side with regards to this conflict, because I mean it's obvious, right? How can one country have the right to massacre literally almost like 35,000 people? And again, with anybody with empathy can't look at those numbers and still say that that country's justified in what they've done against another country. These lot have violated every level of human rights that you can imagine. I mean, this is not my opinion, by the way. The perspective of the United Nations, right? This is the perspective of like International Court of Justice And South Africa, a country that is known for having a long history of apartheid, took Israel to the International Court of Justice, right? Accusing them of a genocide. So I find it weird how some people label this as being an example of a plausible genocide. What does that mean? Plausible basically is arguing that a possibility of a genocide. Bro, not a single person could tell me that what we're looking at is not a genocide. Not only that, but like the fact that Israel has the ability and the power to be able to cut food away from people in Gaza speaks volumes. And what really distinguishes the two groups' power, right? Israel can do whatever the fuck they want to do in Gaza, whatever the fuck they want to do to Palestinians, right? But they can't do nothing. They can't go out of Gaza. You know what I mean? It's like, it's ridiculous, right, ladies and gentlemen? So I want you to smash the like button down below and comment and subscribe as well with your notification bells down. Peace.